A very warm good morning to all of you, and thank you for coming. Thank you to the ICDD for hosting me. This particular topic that I'm going to speak to is part of a project that I'm busy with. It's the 6th volume in the Democratic Marxism series titled Capitalism Against Democracy. And this potentially is going to be a chapter in there, so it's a kind of work in progress kind of contribution, and I'm going to use you all as a sounding board, so the feedback I get is also going to help me frame and focus this chapter I'm writing. So, to kick off, I'm sure most people in this room are familiar with Anthropocene theory, and you know, it's this big marker of geological, historical and climatological time. The geologists have officially now declared they're going to use this category to mark off big scales of time. We've left the Holocene, 11,000 years of a relatively stable climate. That was, if you like, the second world or planet that we've had. Before that, we had a planet that was pretty erratic and largely very hot, with a few ice ages thrown in. We are now entering a third world, a third planetary world which we are creating. And Anthropocene discourse foregrounds that human beings are the geological force shaping planetary conditions today. It's also official speak in a lot of the International Panel of Climate Change discourse. The framing of the science, the official discourse, is grounded in a lot of Anthropocene stuff. And a lot of it comes across as technocratic and sometimes reads as anthropocentric, if you like. We are the apex species, we've arrived, we have now prevailed over nature and planet Earth, and, well, it's our time. So this is me as a social scientist taking issue with documents that are largely prepared by physicists, climatologists, and so on. And I would really argue that these perspectives really fall short in terms of social scientific explanation. And I'm going to be interrogating some of that in trying to situate, if you like, eco-fascism. I'm not going to get into the whole argument about the Anthropocene and theory, but just to say that there's two versions in my reading of Anthropocene theory. The first version, Anthropocene 1, if you like, is about this very shallow, facile, generic human causality. We are all culpable for climate change. We all caused it, etc. I'm going to focus on Anthropocene 2. And this is really a perspective from the global south around capitalism's crises. It's about imperial ecocide. It's about capital as a geological force, eco-racism, eco-patriarchy, and mass resistance. So I'm going to be talking to you, if you like, to this framing of Anthropocene, in which there are real material social forces that have contributed to the climate crisis. We can explain the climate crisis from a political economy, social analysis perspective. I just want to bring into the conversation this category of ecocide, and basically say that ecocide relates to this making of capitalism. The short history of ecocide and a logic of the destruction of the conditions of life is 150 years. That's if you use Anthropocene 1. Okay? But if you really think about the making of capitalism, it has a longer history. It has a 500-year history. And in that 500-year history, capitalism has been built on the basis of genocidal violence, the destruction of ecosystems, and, if you like, what Rosa Luxemburg would call the domination of the natural economy. People like Karl Polanyi will talk about this as the enclosures, the ending of the commons. So capitalism in its DNA, in its originary moments, etc., has been about this domination of nature, human and non-human nature. And in that process has, if you like, a ecocidal logic. It has been constructed. And that means that it's a system that interlocks various crisis tendencies, including, if you like, food system crisis tendencies, water system crisis tendencies, and the destruction of ecosystems and human life. And it's brought us to a very dangerous point of a crisis of capitalist civilization. And so, for me to jump into the conversation around the rise of eco-fascism, this notion of ecocide, and to some extent the structural logic of capitalism, is very, very important. This is a system that's wiping us out. That's the argument. Okay. Now, if we look at sort of the climate crisis using this very provocative metaphor of a global gas chamber, you know, using the notion of the gas chamber has a particular resonance in this particular context. But I think it's very apt. And the young people I talk to use this idea. Okay? They tell me, your generation has created this gas chamber that's killing us. Okay? The carbon emissions. Now, of course, if you look at the science, the UN report that came out last year, the 1.5 degrees Celsius report, it is really, if you like, the most important scientific report that has come out over the past 20 odd years. It is raising the alarm bell very loud. It has put out very clearly the challenge we have, based on the consensus science, that we have 12 years to bring down carbon emissions dramatically, and of course by 2050 to be at net zero. Very big challenge for our civilization and for all of us. At the same time, we are seeing extreme weather shocks, and this comes with various costs, but particularly costs of human and non-human life. The region I come from is in a climate chaos zone right now. We've had two major cyclones that have battered through parts of our region, hitting Mozambique first, 3 million people displaced, etc. We have the Sahel region where 5 million people right now are food insecure because there's a bad drought. We have about 300,000, mainly women and children, insecure in Kenya, etc. So, as climate crisis worsens, it reproduces a whole set of inequalities and so on, and exacerbates existing inequalities. We are also seeing at the same time species extinction, soil degradation, and a whole set of water constraints coming to the fore. So the recent UN panel on biodiversity, and I don't like the second part of the name of this panel, ecosystem services, I like to call it the UN panel on biodiversity, has put out a very important report a few weeks ago, really talking about the crisis of our soils, largely because of industrial agriculture. We probably have 60 years of use of our soils on planet Earth. That's how bad it is. It's been poisoned using chemicals, etc., etc. But in the main, I think if we were to understand all of this, we have to bring in class, we have to bring in race, we have to bring in ecological relations and gender that are driving these dynamics. Now, despite the over 20-year sort of discourse around climate, the science that we've had and so on, we have not really moved things very far. We have seen at least 2 cycles of resistance in the context of neoliberalization, and a lot of this is also exhausted and it's running out of steam, and there's various limits and contradictions being expressed amongst these forces. However, climate and eco-justice forces have been part of this milieu, these cycles of resistance and so on. So if you take the Cochabamba People's Summit of 2010, largely convened by Bolivia but indigenous peoples' movements, it affirms a long history, a 500-year history of fighting to defend life outside of the centers of capitalism. But out of that as well, you've seen a whole set of other struggles emerging. Over 20 years, we've seen struggles to gridlock extractivism, largely in the global south. Ende Gelände is very important in the German context around this. But you also have, at the same time, the rise of new forces. The children's striking for climate futures, you have the Extinction Rebellion, you have the Sunrise Movement in the US, etc. And it's very, very important to recognize that these forces are having some impact. There is a discourse on a deep, just transition coming from trade unions. There is an agenda around democratic systemic reform emerging. The Green New Deal is interesting in this perspective, maybe not as radical as some of us would like it to be. In South Africa, we are working on a climate justice charter to bring to the fore crucial systemic transformative alternatives. The New Zealand government has just declared a well-being budget. The Prime Minister is broken with growth, something we should look at. It's an interesting development. There's also a new horizon emerging beyond capitalism, a new imaginary in this context. So this is a bit of the good news, but what's the response? Well, the reaction of carbon capital to the climate crisis generally for the past few decades. I mean, ExxonMobil knew about this in 1970, and then of course just put the rap on it. But the conjunctural response has really been to push back. In the context of a crisis-ridden neoliberalized capitalism, deepening inequalities, we are seeing the rise of a new right. Neoliberal capitalism is mutating beyond, in a contingent way, beyond hegemonic neoliberal capitalism, beyond a cooperative neoliberal capitalism. It is becoming an authoritarian capitalism. It has had this in its DNA by privileging the power of capital over our societies, over our political institutions. This is a dynamic that is part of this logic of financialization. But at the same time, these right-wing forces that are emerging are not really breaking fundamentally with globalization. They are still very productivist and carbon-centric. I know some of the right in Europe have a yearning for the golden days of social democracy, which was based on an exclusionary nationalism and a carbon-centric capitalism. You're also seeing in this mix a whole set of intimated projects, green capitalism, climate capitalism, and so on. But in the main, the project that has come to the fore has affirmed the interests of carbon capital. If you look at the reports of the International Energy Agency, despite over 20 years of climate negotiations, despite all the science, carbon emissions are going up. Carbon use right now in the international global energy mix is still carbon-centered. We have shifted mainly now increasingly to gas. Okay? So we are continuing to cook ourselves, basically. Not all of us. Again, it is carbon capital driving this process. Sort of converging in all of this, a whole set of discourses around climate-smart agriculture, technotopia, and so on. But because of time, I'm going to transition very quickly into, well, so there's this battle going on, and where does eco-fascism fit into it, and how does eco-fascism express itself in the context of the emergence of a new right? Well, fascism is an interesting topic, a complex topic, and there's a very interesting literature with very tight definitions, different interpretive approaches, particularly on the interwar years of fascism. It's a very important literature that we can and must learn from. There's a strong liberal current in this literature, for example, and if you were to evoke this liberal approach to fascism and use a comparative framework, methodologically, you'll be talking about, well, what's common and what's different, okay? And you'll end up with a checklist, an ideal type of fascism. And you will look at the present through the lens of this checklist. Are they big men? Are they authoritarians? Are they anti-parliament? Are they militarists? Etc., etc. And that is useful to some extent, and it will tell us something about fascism. However, I do think that we need to think more deeply about fascism. Fascism has its roots in structural dynamics. And I don't want to put forward a definition of fascism, but really suggest that there's an approach to how we study fascism. It's a tendency within monopoly capitalism and the current phase of transnational techno-financial capitalism. It emerges in the context of crises of capitalism, that underpin the interwar years as well. And it takes on an organized form to have a monopoly over state power. So this is not a definition of capitalism, but it is a methodological approach to trying to think about and situate the emergence of capitalism. This means then our task is to really study capitalism in situ, in context, empirically, okay? So, and here too there are certain methodological challenges about how we understand contemporary fascism. The history of fascism is largely a history of Europe-centered fascism. However, from a decolonial perspective, I would argue there was a second moment of fascism in the 20th century. There was a second moment of fascism in the 20th century, and this had to do with the peripheries of capitalism. That second moment of fascism was propped up and promoted by the United States. Okay? So 300,000 or 200,000 Maya peoples in Guatemala get wiped out. Okay? 1 million people get wiped out in Indonesia. Okay? You have the harshest military dictatorships in Latin America from 1964 onwards. There's been no reckoning with that moment of fascism. So we've got to think about that methodologically when we're thinking about fascism today. The case studies or the comparator may not just be interwar year fascism. The second methodological challenge, of course, is using case studies, both conjunctural and longer durée case studies, to understand fascism today. And then lastly, to ground fascism in the nature of the contemporary crises of capitalism. Now, Aliances has some interesting things to say about what I just said. Okay? But my argument is that contemporary neo-fascism, led by carbon capital and US imperialism, is climate fascist, and more generally eco-fascist. It is destroying the planetary conditions that sustain life. It is leading the extinction of human and non-human life forms, and this is a crucial characteristic and specificity of contemporary fascism. So very quickly to run through some of the aspects that kind of come together here in terms of the ideological, economic and political relations and the social forces that are driving this kind of, if you like, eco-fascism. Well, first, and I've been alluding to this, carbon capital and ongoing accumulation. And I've mentioned something about the global carbon mix, at the energy mix at the moment, and the fact that carbon capital has invested in terms of its horizons and is locked into complex hydrocarbons at the moment, from fracking, offshore drilling, tar sands, etc. In the global south, ironically, 23 state corporations control 76% of carbon reserves right now. 4 of those corporations are Chinese. There's Brazil's Petrobras and so on. But in the main, what we are seeing is that carbon capital has ensured that its interests are at the center of continuing and reproducing carbon-centric development. This means we heat the planet. We're also seeing Trumpism and climate change acceleration. So the United States has the largest carbon footprint. We are seeing Trumpism as an ideological force expressing itself very powerfully through its nationalism, through its anti-elitism, its xenophobia, etc. But in the main, to reproduce a carbon-centric capitalism. You know, Trump has taken the discourse around climate change back, but fortunately, or unfortunately, climate shocks are also registering in the United States, from flooding to wildfires to massive hurricanes, etc. That's also contesting and disrupting, if you like, this kind of dominant discourse. But in the main, I mean, what we are seeing is an acceleration of climate change. Trump has, through executive orders, through certain deployments in the US bureaucracy, etc., has opened up further carbon extraction in the United States. So he's pushed back against the Keystone pipeline struggles, etc. So basically, the dominant imperial power on planet Earth is not interested in solving the problem of climate change. Its response, actually, and the US Pentagon has the most sophisticated thinking around climate change. It recognizes it as a security threat to US interests. So in the main, it's all about Lifeboat America, and it's all about policing the zones of chaos. We've also seen a Neo-Malthusian racism and ethno-nationalism come to the fore as well and converge and constitute, if you like, this new eco-fascism. And you've seen its origins are in sort of green thinking, modernization thinking, and so on. And basically, population is foregrounded as the problem. You see this in the IPCC reports, Anthropocene 1, population, big problem around climate change. You see it in the International Panel on Biodiversity. Population is a big problem for ecosystems collapse. Well, you end up with this impression, well, that the darker nations are the problem, okay? In Africa, in Asia, and so on. And so all of you in Europe are fine. We are the problem. That's not true, actually. If you really look at it from the perspective of inequality, and if you look at it in terms of consumption and footprints, which these reports don't do, the average European has a consumption footprint from January till now. If you reproduce it on a planetary scale, we'll need 2.5 planets, basically. If you do the same exercise for Americans, you'll need 3 planets, okay? So it's not the global south that has the resource-intensive, extractivist, etc. Way of life, okay? Somebody called it the imperial way of life, my very close friend Ulrich Brandt. So, in the end, you know, at least 200 million people will be displaced on the African continent because of climate shocks, etc. The European long summer, where you absorbed at least, I think, what, 1 million people in Germany? Well, that's a small story. The big story is coming, okay? And as climate change and climate shocks intensify, you're going to see more people moving on planet Earth. Now that means, of course, that discourses amongst the right, in Europe, etc., are going to become increasingly virulent. They're going to become increasingly racist. Border Europe is going to become a big part of the politics. It's there now, and it's going to become more intensified. So there's a whole set of forces driving this kind of approach, this kind of discourse. In the African context, there's the G7 Food Security Alliance. It's about a productivist, globalized agriculture. There's going to be massive winners and losers in this version of the Green Revolution. And again, we are a social engineering project in the African context. And then, of course, there's another element, which is the plutocratic escape kind of thrust around all of this, where elites talk about markets, finance and technology. These techno-fixers will come together. We're going to have a problem. We don't have to revisit our assumptions of normality. All will be fine. We'll manage risks through wealth. You know, the wealthy have basically taken out climate insurance. When wildfires hit them, helicopters pick them up, take them to safe ground. They put up in fancy hotels, etc. They've bought high ground property and things like that. But in the main, this is all about technotopia. And underlying this, of course, is this notion of dominating nature. We can geo-engineer the planetary space. We can engage in carbon capture and storage. The 4th industrial revolution is here. And of course, the robots are going to save us, etc., etc. This is, again, another very important plutocratic discourse. And it is premised on the idea that we have full domination of planet Earth. But at the heart of this is biocapital. Is the idea that we can remake our relationship with nature. Another very crucial dimension in the eco-fascism today, of course, is the hollowing out of market democracy and the sovereignty of capital, trumping the sovereignty of democratic institutions. And I've mentioned the authoritarian turn in neoliberalism. But you're also seeing a very interesting discourse amongst climate denialists who are actually arguing, and there's an interesting book about this coming out of Australia, that democracy is the problem, not climate. Okay? So again, this convergence with authoritarianism and so on, the US military perspectives are really, at one level, scary, but all of these things are coming together, if you like, to reproduce the ecocidal logic of capitalism today. Well, there's some hope, particularly if we construct a new politics. If we attempt to build mass popular power again, A lot of this has been eviscerated over the 3.5 or odd decades of neoliberalism. We've become very individualized. Collective agency is a difficult problem. But as I said, there have been cycles of resistance. There are forces emerging. They have some limits as crowd politics. We need to go beyond that. We need to build institutionalized climate justice alliances. We need to build powerful movements that can shift our societies towards the deep, just transition. There's a whole set of questions around this, around the politics of this. Because of time, I'm not going to get into it. But just to say that, and as I've said, systemic alternatives are where our politics should be located. It means a new theory of change, of course. It does mean that we don't have to wait for change to come from the state. It means that from below, we can start using commoning. We can start using food sovereignty pathways. We can start advancing climate jobs and things like that. Socially owned renewable energy, etc. in our communities. And to conclude, and to sum up, my last slide, eco-fascism is part of the new right. Eco-fascism is at the vanguard of managing ecocidal capitalism and ensuring the 6th extinction on planet Earth. It refuses to accept the need for a fundamental rupture with carbon capitalism and the need for a deep, just transition to sustain human and non-human life. And the left has a challenge of building red and green alliances to advance a democratic eco-socialist class project now. Thank you.